Welcome, everybody, to August Off the Shelf. Before I jump into anything specifically, Tara or Shane, do you have any announcements for anybody, or are you okay for me to just jump in?
Go ahead.
Hi, Braden.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, everybody, for joining. The Off the Shelf series is something we launched a few years ago, partly because we felt it was a way to reach more people rather than live training, and also as a response to COVID and increased telework, things like that. But we recognize that you're all very busy, right? Everyone's busy. And so we really appreciate you taking the time and allow us to share things that we think will be very helpful to you. I do want to remind you that this session is being recorded. I'm assuming you've seen that before and that you have no problems with that. That's me. I'm Dan Chase. I'll be facilitating our conversation today. I'm the director of the Leadership and Organizational Development Team, part of DHRM. I think it's the best team in the state of Utah, certainly the best team I've ever belonged to in my professional career. And I mean that genuinely. Before we jump into our content of organizational culture, which is a massive topic, right? I do want to remind you that next month, you want to put this on your calendars now. We're going to get to hear from JJ Acker about how to ask more effective questions. This is going to be September 25th, 10 a.m. That's the last Wednesday of the month again. Please put that on your calendar. Shane, of course, will be sending you links to register. But JJ always does a really fantastic job of putting things in very clear and simple terms in very consumable ways. And I can't overstate to you how effective questions are. So Shane will be sending that out to you. Also, those of you, if you want to stick around after, we'll be able to ask JJ about beard maintenance. So that'll be super helpful as well. I'm sure he has some powerful insights there. So anyway, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take this massive topic of organizational culture, one of the most common terms that we hear, and we're going to define organizational culture. And I'll tell you right now, I'm trying to speak as quickly as I can just to get exercise for Teresa's hands, but we're going to define organizational culture, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time will be spent on defining organizational culture, because it is that complex. And we'll get into, well, what's leadership's job with this, and how does it impact engagement? Why do we care about this? Why should we care about culture? We'll talk about diagnosing your organizational cultural health, and then finally, if we want to change our culture, what do we do? Now, I will tell you, this is a very tricky topic. Me and my team, we were talking about this last week or something, and culture always comes up, and yet it's one of those things that you and I might not be able to change just individually. Culture is so massive that you can't say right now, I work for DHHS and I'm going to go change the culture and it's going to change entirely. So some of you might be asking, well, then what are we doing here? Well, we'll talk about what you can do, but also this is such an important topic. We want to give you an understanding of it. So as you increase in authority in an organization, you tend to, that's an important qualifier, you tend to have more opportunity to impact culture. So we want to prepare you for that as well. So let's talk about some myths that relate to organizational culture. And I'm going to fly through these because you have these on the slide, and it's also going to be recorded. It's being recorded, right? First, that there is one effective universal culture that we should all be aspiring to. No, whether a culture is effective or appropriate or good or not depends on many factors. We'll talk about those factors. And even though I just said as you and I move up in responsibility, we have more opportunity to impact culture, it is not only top management. There are lots of leaders, C-suite, executive directors that I'm going to go change the culture. But if the people in the organization are resistant, they can't change the culture either, right? Just talking about changes to the culture will change nothing, by the way, is another myth. That organizational culture is easy to change is maybe the most pernicious myth out there. It is labor intensive, okay? There's some that say organizational culture doesn't matter, only other external rewards, things like that matter. That's simply not true. And here, unfortunately, one of the reasons we want to talk about this, there's a myth out there that organizational culture is easy to see and easy to comprehend. It simply isn't, right? That's simply not the case, right? culture is difficult. In fact, if I can get this to play, I've shown this video before as I've talked to groups about organizational culture. Here's one of the things that makes culture so tricky. So now this video is about 1.5 minutes. I hope the sound works. If not, you'll still be able to get the gist of it. Someone, Salote, I can see you. So you give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound on this, right? So just watch what happens here, and then we'll talk about what this has to do with culture. Is that playing? Okay, tell you what. Still no sound? No. Okay, that's fine. You just watch this. So what it is, you can see this is like the street performers. By the way, these things are becoming more common now. This is in Europe, and they say, "Hey, come and do limbo," right? And it looks like kind of like either Caribbean clothing or Brazilian, right? They're like, "Hey, come and do limbo," so that we're going to blindfold you, and then they leave. Now, if you're on the street and you don't see those limbo folks and you just see people walking like this, what is your reaction? Someone put a sad face. That's the first time ever someone's put a sad face emoji to this thing. Okay. But I won't necessarily play this whole thing through, but here's the point. Culture is so powerful, and it's easy. It is so hard to detect that we don't know how it influences us. So keep watching this. So what seems like normal behavior in one context, maybe in one organization, let's say you came from an organization, your first job ever, they loved holidays. Okay, they loved holidays. So you get a new job in a new organization, and it's Halloween. And so you're like, oh, I'm going to come with the best costume. And so you show up on Halloween, you have this most extravagant costume. You get there and everyone's like, what are you doing? We don't dress up here. Like, that's just weird. What seemed like normal behavior in one context was not, in one culture was not in another context, in another culture, right? And that's how powerful culture is. So look at this. Here's what's tricky. It's undetectable most of the time. If I only have lived in one place, or if I have only worked in one organization, I am not even likely to be able to detect the organizational culture. In my mind, it will just feel like, oh, that's how work is. That's how professional life is, right? So what we need to do is we can be like, okay, if culture is that tricky, let's get to our first thing and our biggest topic here. Let's talk about defining what organizational culture is. So stay with me here. Look, I'm not going to read all these quotes verbatim. Okay, you can read them. We're going to have a lot of quotes, a lot of explanations of what organizational culture is, but it is so powerful. Andy McKee, who's written a lot on emotional intelligence and culture and other things, it tells us what's good, what's wrong, what's appropriate behavior in one. Think about national cultures. What is totally appropriate in one culture might not be appropriate in another culture. That's the same thing with organizational cultures. It tells you what is good or bad even, right? Or look at this from an article from Harvard Business Review. Culture, it tells us what is discouraged, accepted, or rejected, or encouraged. In other words, it tells us, here's how you should behave. Here are our cultural norms. Here's how people who want to thrive here, here's how they behave, right? This is how powerful culture is. And most of us today, most of us belong to organizations that represent what anciently might be our tribe. So you might have a family, which represents a tribe. You might have a religious community, which represents a tribe. You might belong to a civic organization or something that represents a tribe. But organizations, our jobs, probably represent the most obvious daily tribes that we belong to, and they have norms, they have cultures there, right? So here's one thing that holds true for most cultures. First of all, their cultures have shared unwritten rules. Meaning that I go into if I'm raised in a certain culture, I don't even realize that it's the culture that's teaching me how something is normal. And then of course, every individual also shapes the culture. Does that make sense? This is why this is so nebulous and why it's so powerful, but also why it's so ambiguous almost, right? So every person is shaped by the culture, but then of course every person shapes the culture. It's also pervasive. As much as leaders are primarily the ones who get to impact culture, it from top to bottom, from the most frontline new employee to the most senior leader in an organization, they are impacted by culture, right? The other thing that's important here is that it's enduring. And here's how culture tends to perpetuate itself. It's really fascinating. It's called attraction, selection, attrition. So let's say I work in government partly because I'm drawn to public service. So I go to where culture, and I'm risk averse, by the way. So government seems really kind of appealing to me. Then we have a culture, generally speaking, in government, in our agencies, even though they're all very different. We'll talk about that. We tend to hire people that we think will thrive in this culture. So that perpetuates the culture even more. And then those that don't fit culturally, they tend to either we get rid of them or they self-select out through attrition, right? And so the culture, without us even realizing that this is how it's happening, the culture reinforces itself, right? And maybe most importantly, culture is implicit. You and I, whether we realize it or not, we are hardwired to recognize it and respond to it. And we don't even do it consciously. When we go to a new culture and we start picking up on new norms, anybody with any sort of awareness starts to go, oh, people here don't challenge the boss. In my old job, the boss expected us to tell them when we disagreed, and that was really celebrated. And we quickly learned here in this new team, this new organization, that's not the case, right? So it happens to us. In fact, I'll give you a weird example. So many of you know I grew up in a small town called Laie, Hawaii, and my kids are always thrown when we take them back to Hawaii. And I don't mean to do this, but I get around my friends and my family, and I start speaking pidgin, yeah? The boga come out strong. I don't even think about them. And it comes out, and my kids are like, what's wrong with Dad? Like, Dad, why are you talking like that? Because it's called code switching, right? Here in Utah, the pidgin just doesn't really come out like that, right? And so it's implicit, right? We respond to our cultural norms, okay? So we're still making our argument here about what culture is. Two cultural experts, Cameron and Ross here. Look at the bold here is the main thing. There's lots of words here, but the one I want you to pay attention to, if you've ever moved organizations, you know that those organizations were just different. You've changed jobs, you've gone to, and you're like, wow, this place is different than my last place. It is culture, it's DNA that makes it unique, right? So let's talk about some other quick considerations as it relates to organizational culture. First of all, what we want is strong cultures. A strong culture does not mean a good culture. A strong culture is if we were to survey everybody in your agency, and for the most part, they agreed that these are what our values and assumptions are. This is what matters here. This is what it's like here. This is what our DNA is here. You would say it's a strong culture. There are other cultures where there's lots of disagreement. There's confusion about what the culture is. That's a weak culture. It is less powerful. Now, you can have a strong culture and it can be a strong, toxic culture. That's not good, right? Or you can have a positive culture, but it's a weak culture and there's not a lot of agreement there. Both those things can be there. Secondarily, remember when we said there's no one universal good culture to have? A lot of it depends on if it's a good environmental fit. As different as our agencies are, and they all have different cultures, they all share a similar parent culture in Utah state government. Does that make sense? And so we have to recognize, because we're all responsive to the legislature, to the governor's office, things like that, to the public, that our cultures that we have in our agencies need to be a good fit to their external environment. And then lastly, what makes a culture good or bad is it aligned to the strategy of the organization? We'll see this phrase again, but it's often attributed to Peter Drucker, but he never actually said it. But this idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast, you better have your culture and your strategy aligned, right? You better have your culture and your purpose aligned, or it's going to be ineffective for what you're trying to accomplish in your organization. Okay. Now I'm moving quickly here. We're going to keep going because I want to get you everything. I think. Look at this slide now. I've shared this before when I've come to some of your agencies. and shared about org culture, when I've shared it online. I think this is the most important slide. If you want to really understand organizational culture, I think this is the most important slide. And we use the imagery of the iceberg, right? Because icebergs are, we see an iceberg above the water and we think like, oh yeah, that's pretty big. And we have no idea that the real power, the real size of the iceberg is beneath the surface. That is also true of organizational culture. Okay. That's also true of organizational culture. So we see artifacts, and we'll go through these: material, symbols, language, rituals, stories, myths, things like that. And we're like, oh yeah, that's the culture. No, that's the surface. That's what you see. Then near, right at the surface, maybe a little above the surface, a little below, is espoused values, the values we claim to have. We love our employees in this agency. We build trust. Things like that. But beneath the surface, maybe the most driving force in an org culture are underlying assumptions, those things that we don't even think about, okay, that really motivate what we do and really give an org culture its distinctiveness. So we're going to take each of these in turn as we continue to define culture. All right. Artifacts, material, symbols. I have a ping pong table here as the image because I once worked in an agency where the boss brought in a ping pong table into the break room, and it was awesome. Okay. He also brought in an old 80s arcade game where it had a bunch of like Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Centipede, Space Invaders, things like that. Let me tell you, by the way, maybe unsurprisingly, he was told, you probably better get rid of that. This is on a third floor of a state agency building, but he was told, you probably better get rid of that, because if the public saw that, they'd be like, what is this? You guys are wasting our tax dollars just playing video games and ping pong, right? And yet, if you were to go to like Adobe at the point of the mountain, or, certainly Google and some of these Silicon Valley tech organizations, ping pong tables, free massages, cafeterias, things like that. These material symbols are the things that we think are culture, right? That we look at, that are visible to us, right? When I walk into a building, is it open? Is it closed off? Is it new? Is it old? Things like that. Immediately, you get a vibe when you walk into an organization. The posters on the wall, the decor, all that, the actual physical structures, more offices, or is it more open plan with cubicles? All that kind of stuff, whether you and I realize it consciously or not, is telling us something about the culture. The problem is most of us see that stuff, we say, that's the culture. If we stop there, that's a problem. Now, there's some other artifacts we need to talk about. The language that we use, that organizations have shared languages, especially in the state. We love our acronyms, right? We love our acronyms in the state. And you and I feel like we're part of a culture when we share that same language. I remember when I first started working for HR, my boss said something about, oh, we need to go meet at the SOB or something like that. I'm like, my first or second demo, what the heck is he talking about? The SOB? Like, and it's a state office building, right? But I didn't know the language yet. Or my very first job with the state was at a facility where they called people individuals out of respect for the people that live there, right? And I had a buddy who was trying to get a hold of me once. This is the very early days of cell phones. So he couldn't get a hold of me. So he called the main office of this facility. And he said, yeah, can I get a hold of Dan Chase? And the operator, not knowing that other people don't speak this insider language, said, well, is he an individual? And my buddy's like, oh, sure, I guess. Like, yeah, he kind of does his own thing. He's an individual. And she's like, nope, I don't have any individuals here by that name. Instead, not getting that, right? And so he's like confused, like, Dan, you told me you work there. I'm like, yeah, individual there means that, right? So your organizations, whether you realize it or not, have different languages for things. Okay. Moving on. Rituals and ceremonies. There's lots of organizations, whether you realize it or not, if you have a summer meeting, if you have a winter meeting, if you guys celebrate years of service in your organization, those are all rituals and ceremonies which tell you if something is important or not. I remember one years ago that told me they used to have a party every time the legislative session ended. It's kind of like, we're done with that. Let's time to celebrate that we made it through, our budget's intact, things like that. Those are rituals and ceremonies, okay? And then finally, stories and legends. Let me give you one that this culture is diminishing a little bit. Southwest Airlines used to have a very distinctive organizational culture. And they used to share stories about their founder, Herb Kelleher, and because he was kind of a goofy, fun-loving, jokey kind of guy. And there are all these stories that kind of become legends throughout the years about things that he would do to make the work. Here he is a CEO, right? But he was trying to perpetuate a culture, and the stories that they would tell about Herb Kelleher perpetuate that culture, right? All of these are artifacts. All of these things are very obvious and very visible, right? So those are the artifacts that we have. Now, stay with me. Remember, this is our most important image as we talk about culture. Next thing we're going to talk about here, right, maybe above the surface, but still below the surface, are espoused values. I'm willing to bet that every single one of your agencies, and maybe even for you bigger ones, even your divisions. Yeah, see, Karen, I don't know if you can see that in the chat. Karen said, like, yeah, that she used to work for Southwest, and it was a fun culture. I bet every one of your agencies has a value statement somewhere that says, hey, this is who we are, right? Those are good and those are necessary. The problem is espoused values don't necessarily represent your culture. They represent the culture very often that you want the public or even the organizational members to believe the culture is. And we really get in trouble, where we get in trouble, and we'll talk about this near the end of our conversation, we get in trouble when there is a real gap between the espoused values and the enacted values. In other words, the organization says this, but they actually do this, that's when there's cultural conflict, and it creates toxicity and cynicism in an organization, right? Now, in a strong culture, in a healthy culture, the degree to which there is alignment between your espoused values, what you claim to be about, and that you are actually about, the more those are aligned, the healthier and the stronger the culture tends to be, right? And it's almost when espoused values that become enacted values, those become the underlying assumptions, right? So it's a little bit like this cartoon that I've used before, where it's like, well, we say this, we're the company with a heart, but what we really want you to do is be terrified. If you screw up, you're in trouble, right? That happens a lot. In fact, I remember I worked with a group a long time ago. The employees told me that when they had like a new employee orientation kind of thing, they share with the new employees the company values, and the tenured employees who had been there for a while, when they would see it, they would laugh at the values on there because it was such a toxic work environment, yet the values that they would share with these new employees were so grandiose and so ambitious and so noble. And the people that actually had worked there for a long time were like, bull crap, that is not how things are here. And it was, and unsurprisingly, it was a very, very toxic culture for them, okay? Now, one more time. Let's talk about when there's a conflict. Now, this is becoming kind of a dated example, but you can't really, I don't know if you can see this or not, but yeah, everyone will get access to these slides, and we'll make sure that you have these. Here's Enron, right? Talk about screwing people over. Here is an actual list of Enron's value statement. As you look at that, do it right, do it now. It talks about ethics near the bottom, listening to the customer. If you were to read Enron's value statement, you'd be like, oh my gosh, what a great company. What a great place to work. And then you look at what the leaders actually valued, the actual culture at Enron, and anybody who knew anything would say that is such garbage, right? That's just nonsense, okay? So this Enron is what happens when you have big gaps between your espoused values and your enacted values, right? Now, finally, this is where it gets a little more complex. Let's talk about underlying assumptions. This is the real driving force of an organization's culture. And let me give you a quick example. So in June, I was flying home, and I'll try to make this brief. I was flying home on Delta, Salt Lake Airport, to Hawaii to go see my family, right? 11 o'clock flight, about 11 o'clock. It was the direct flight from Salt Lake to Honolulu. And we get on the flight. We're on the flight for like an hour, and the auxiliary power went out. And this is late June in Salt Lake, and it's just, someone had to they had to get medical personnel because someone was passing out in the back of the plane. It was so hot, miserable. They're like, guys, we got to get off the flight. So we get off the flight. They're like, yeah, we're going to get you back on there. They tell us that, so we all stick around. Then they say, you know what, the flight's been bumped to 1 o'clock. Okay, fine. 1 o'clock rolls around. They're like, you know what? Hey, we're not able to get that part. It's being flown in from California. So then our flight got bumped to 3 o'clock. Okay, that's aggravating. I'm like, I could have gone home in that time. I could have been, Then 5 o'clock rolls around. 3 o'clock doesn't happen. They're like, you know what? Our pilot's timed out. Now we have to wait for a pilot to come from Atlanta. We have to wait for us to get some pilots. So what did they do? Here's what's interesting. All of a sudden, they brought out these carts of little cans of Pringles and fruit snacks. It's a nice gesture, right? Here's what I overheard, though. By the way, don't get me wrong. I took the Pringles and the fruit snacks, okay, because I'll always take free food. But the people next to me were like, do they think this matters to us, even though we're missing our trip to Hawaii? They're taking time out of our trip to Hawaii. Now, look, I'm not blaming Delta. If a plane breaks down, I don't want to fly on it. By the way, we didn't end up leaving till like 11 o'clock that night, okay, or like midnight that night. But the people next to me, literally, they were saying, do they think we're stupid? When you have underlying assumptions in an organization, and we'll get to what some of those underlying assumptions are, you can throw all the pizza parties, giving the free fruit snacks and the Pringles that you want, but your people in the organization, the underlying assumptions will always overpower those small gestures that leaders sometimes use to placate organizational members. Does that make sense? Just like the people at terminal were like, or that gate were like, screw you guys, get us to Hawaii. We don't care about the Pringles and the fruit snacks, right? Trust is broken when there's a compromise in those underlying assumptions and those small gestures. And I'm not saying a pizza party is never of any value. The problem is too many leaders across the globe are like, but I threw you guys a pizza party. Why are we not good, right? It has if your underlying assumptions about your employees, about the nature of work, about your culture are bad, that will have little, the Pringles and the fruit snacks are going to have little impact. So what are some underlying assumptions that we might have? Think about your organizations as you look at this list. Okay, think about your agencies right now as we go through this list. It could be about innovation and risk taking. So we may say that we want to be super innovative and take a bunch of risk. Generally speaking, in state government, we want to be very qualified about that. Okay, we have to be somewhat risk averse, right? Attention to detail. Maybe you had a job before where it's like detail mattered immensely, and if there was a typo, it screwed up an entire contract. Or you have another job where it's like, it doesn't matter if you get the spelling right, whatever it might be. Outcome orientation, where it's like, how much is it where we care about the actual outputs versus maybe like people orientation, where it's like, no, we want people to feel that they're cared for, right? There's a whole range here of things that might be underlying assumptions about how you feel about an organization's real assumptions about what matters. Team orientation might be the degree to which they feel like work should be done through teams versus through individuals. Many who have worked in the private sector recognize that maybe compared to public sector, not always, but maybe compared to public sector, if you've worked in the private sector, it's a much more aggressive. The underlying assumption is aggression is good, competition is good. You need to beat out not just the external competition, but beat out your peers, right? Versus stability. How much, and I think this probably applies to a lot of our agencies where it's like stability matters. In institutions, stability tends to matter quite a bit. And then I've added this one, theory X, theory Y, which is, theory X is employees can't be trusted. They need to be watched like hawks. They'll always get away with everything they can. They're inherently lazy. Theory Y is, no, employees want to be engaged in good work. They can be trusted. Give them important work to do. They'll do it. They'll get it done. My hunch is, to varying degrees, you belong to cultures in your agencies, or even subcultures, microcultures in your agencies that have different underlying assumptions based on, our employees, can they be trusted or can they not? And a lot of your culture is going to stem from whether it's a theory X underlying assumption or it's a theory Y underlying assumption. And then a lot of practices are going to come from that. So you can say, we trust our employees, but if there's an underlying assumption, a theory X underlying assumption, the people in the organization are going to be like, nope, you're just giving us Pringles and fruit snacks. You actually don't trust us. You actually don't trust us. Okay. We got to move on. Okay. I right now, if we were in a live class, I'd say, is everyone doing okay, energy wise, etc.? I can't ask that, right? but I'll get a, hey, thanks for the thumbs up anyway. Now, so what is it? If that's organizational culture, let's talk about the role of leadership in creating positive cultures and things like that. Look at this. Edgar Schein, who I think is maybe the godfather, the guru on organizational culture, said the bottom line for leaders that if they do not become conscious of the cultures in which they're embedded, those cultures will manage them. In fact, it's interesting. Yesterday, you guys, I spent a few hours with 85 leaders from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, right, from the federal government. And this came out very clearly in our conversation. They said, they're like, look, it's really hard if you want to try and, a lot of times we have leaders who want to change the culture, but they feel like they can't. And they came out and they said, maybe that's a distinction between management and leadership. Managers can be successful managers, but generally the culture runs them. Whereas maybe Edgar Schein says here, the definition of a leader is someone who goes in and says, I'm going to look at the culture and see if it aligns with our strategy, see if it aligns with our purpose, and see if it's the positive culture that we want. And the effective leader goes in and they start the very difficult process of changing that culture. Does that make sense? So that's one thing we need to know about leadership and culture, right? And again, we've seen this already, that culture trumps strategy every time. And so a leader's job, very often a leader wants to make sure strategy and culture are aligned because culture is always going to win. But it's usually leadership, people with high levels of formal authority, they get to decide the strategy in the first place. So they need to be the ones being like, are these aligned? If they're not, we need to change something, either our strategy or our culture. And generally speaking, culture is going to win out. Okay, so how do leaders embed and transmit culture? This is from Edgar Schein again. And I think first, the primary embedding mechanisms. This is so important. Okay. First, what leaders pay attention to, measure, and control regularly. And I'm not going to read this entire list. Please read it as I talk with you. But the bottom line is this. Whether you and I know it or not, we pay attention to what leaders pay attention to. So if I learn that, we'll go back to our very easy example. If I learn that in the organization I belong to, leadership does not want to be challenged, that they get defensive when they are challenged, despite them saying like, oh, I love disagreeing and I love this and we need healthy conflict. If I know that I've got a boss that's going to be like that, every time someone has challenged them, they've gotten the cold shoulder, or they've got, whatever, a crappy assignment, or the boss gets defensive, whatever it is, I'm going to learn quickly, oh, don't do that. This is not a culture for conflict here, right? It's who's getting promoted, who's getting pay for performance, what are they doing to getting that pay for performance, right? Who's getting recognition, all that kind of stuff. These are primary embedding mechanisms. Now I got to give some props here to a DHRM person here, my guy John Barrand. Okay, so for example, John Barrand is the director of HR. And he has, maybe for I don't want to say for too long, but very conspicuously since the summer, has been trying to create a culture of gratitude within HR. And he has actually taken these primary embedding mechanisms and really, he always says, look, I know some of you think this is corny. He'll always qualify that, but he's actually created a flag where you've got to hand it to a person that you appreciate in DHRM. And he's actually sticking to his guns on this. He's actually going out of his way to express gratitude. I see it from him. I see John actually walking the talk and expressing gratitude because he's like, look, I realize that I am the primary cultural embedder here as a leader, and creating that culture of gratitude, he's actually sticking to his guns on it. And that's the only way that gratitude is going to change. By the way, gratitude is very important. You will see it later. We also have an off the shelf on it from back in the day that you can go and look at. But I got to give him credit because he's actually walking the talk with it as it relates to gratitude. That's the only way culture is going to change, right? That's a primary embedding mechanism. Now, by the way, I know the sounds on this is not going to work, so we're just going to see if we can skip it. There we go. Okay. So what are the secondary embedding mechanisms? The primary things are the main ways that leaders can embed mechanisms. I'm not going to read all the secondary mechanisms either, but if you look at these, you'll notice that a lot of these are like the artifacts. design and structure, rituals, physical space, right? Stories, formal statements. That's when we start getting into the espoused values, that right above the surface, right below the surface level of organizational culture. So if you can do the previous things, actually walk the talk, put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and leaders are examples of the organizational culture. This is the second way. Actually start creating spaces, rituals, things that back up the organizational culture. Okay. All right. So again, Edgar Schein, culture creation and management are the essence of leadership. And he says that leadership and culture creation are really just two sides of the same coin. I think, and to be honest with you, I agree with Edgar Schein here. I would have a hard time when I'm coaching leaders, if they're almost always, even when I'm working with individual leaders, the conversation comes back to culture. What culture are you creating? And what I will tell you now is what I tell people in training, what I tell people when I'm speaking, what I tell people when I'm doing executive coaching or leadership coaching. It's one of the hardest things a leader can do is to change a culture. But here we are, and we're saying, but that's kind of the very essence of leadership, right? It's the very essence of leadership. Okay, so moving along here really quickly. We've defined organizational culture. We talked about leadership and culture and how leaders are the ones that shape culture. We've talked about the primary and secondary embedding mechanisms, how they go about changing culture. Next, we want to know, and this is kind of related, what impact does this actually have on engagement? What impact does culture have on engagement? Look at this from Paul Zak. This is from an article he wrote. By fostering organizational trust, and you won't see the word engagement in here, but look at the words that I've highlighted because all those relate to engagement. By fostering organizational trust, or let's say a culture of organizational trust, you can increase employees' productivity, energy levels, collaboration isn't highlighted there, but that matters, and cultivate a happier, more loyal workforce. He says more loyal workforce, but if you and I were talking about engagement, I would say he's talking about commitment there, meaning there's no attrition. There's no turnover there. So the question is then, if we want engagement, we create positive cultures of trust, right? So what if you and I can create, if we want engagement and we can create cultures of trust, look at these. I think these numbers are staggering, by the way. And I'll show you, we'll talk specifically about how to create a culture of trust here, but look at the return on investment here from cultures of trust. A study that was done in Harvard, HBR published this. People reported when they had a culture of trust, there was 74% less stress, 106% more energy at work. And I think energy might be one of the most underused words in terms of relationship to engagement. When there is high employee engagement, there is an energy, a palpable energy that comes from employees that is so impactful on our teams and our organizations, and it's contagious, right? And when there's a culture of trust, 106% increase, right? 50% more productive. 13% fewer sick days. And here we go, 76% more engagement. That's a high number. I love this one. 29% higher satisfaction with life and 40% less burnout, right? 40% less burnout. That's massive, right? When we create a culture of trust. Now, if I'm you, I'm sitting there going, hey, this is awesome. So how do we do it? How to create a culture of trust? Now, we talked about how leaders create culture with primary and secondary embedding mechanisms, right? And we'll talk later up near the end of our conversation, which we're getting to, about how to change culture. But specifically in terms of the culture of trust, these are things you need to see. Now, I'm going to share with you about 8 things. I promise you have seen all of these, but more importantly, I promise you the reason we record these is we send you a link to all the past recorded off the shelves. I promise you every single one of these 8 has been taught to in some degree in previous off the shelves. Whether it's like safety, whether it's gratitude, engagement, whatever it might be, you'll see examples of these things. So first, I'm going to go through these really quickly because you're going to look at these going, yep, we need more of that. Yep, we need more of that, right? This is how you create a culture of trust. Give people discretion on how to do their work. Treat them like adults. Let them tell you to the degree that you can how they could most effectively do their work. We call that autonomy, right? Facilitate whole person growth. We have a whole thing on growth, a whole off the shelf on growth, right? But bring the whole person, allow the whole person to grow. Let people be their whole selves as they come to work. September 16th, we've got the governor's wellness initiative that's coming up that all of you should try and attend if you can, that talks about being a whole, complete person at work, right? Intentionally build relationships. Last time I did an off the shelf, we talked about how really, if you want to go far in a career and have happiness in your career, you got to learn how to get along with people. You got to build intentionally, not just hope you have good relationships, but intentionally build relationships with people. Transparency. Share as much information as you are allowed to. Again, it comes back to treating people like adults. And teams that build trust, even if I'm not a supervisor, I share the information I have with my peers, right? So we can make decisions together. Recognize excellence. I know we've got enough to shelf on recognition and other things, but again, you don't have to be a supervisor to do this. When you've got, I got to tell you, I went to dinner last night. I'm not in the state right now. By the way, I'm in a hotel room. That's why you can see me. That's not I'm not in my room. That's not my bed. That's a hotel bed. Okay, I'm a little embarrassed about that. But I went out to dinner last night with a colleague somewhere else. We were meeting with this United States Patent and Trademark Office, and we were both talking about someone that we work with, someone who, in another thing, who's kind of over us, who never says, "Hey, good job." I mean, just never does. Never says, "Hey, thank you for that. That was great." Just not in their DNA. Great leader in other respects, but they just never do. And I've got to be honest with you. When I do some of these, when we work together with this person I went to dinner with last night, there are times where we're like, we kind of leave deflated. We feel like we did a really good job, and we give our heart and soul to something. We're like, not even a thank you, not even a hey, I really appreciate the way you did this. It can be really deflating. Build a culture of trust, a positive culture, by recognizing excellence. We've seen this a million times, but it's just true. You build a culture of trust by being the first to trust, by showing vulnerability, right? I know that we've talked about that in psych safety off the shelf. And then induce eustress. A leader and teams that create cultures of trust don't shy away from hard work. They don't shy away from challenge. But eustress is different from distress. They have appropriate levels of challenge. Give your people challenging work. Make them grow by giving them difficult tasks, but tasks that they certainly can handle and that they have the resources to accomplish. Okay. And then finally, job crafting. I love this one. Wherever you can, and again, sometimes we're limited in what we can do. Help people shape the jobs that they want to have. Am I doing the tasks that I know contribute to our team's bigger purpose, but that allow me to do the things I like to do? The more you can marry those things, the more culture of trust you'll have, and you'll get all the positives that we saw: the engagement levels of higher productivity, happiness at work, 106% more energy, because you've created a culture of trust. And you create the culture of trust through the primary embedding mechanisms and the secondary embedding mechanisms that we saw. Okay, so when properly aligned with personal values and drives and needs, culture can unleash tremendous amounts of, there it is, highlighted again because I love it, energy towards a shared purpose. That's engagement, right? When you've got a shared purpose and you've got energy and your organization is thriving, that's because there is engagement from your people. All right, I'm moving along quickly here because I want to be respectful of your time, and because they're going to kick me out of this hotel room. So how do we diagnose cultural health? Let's define this here for a second about what cultural health is. By the way, I want to be very candid with you. I have worked in places. It was very fascinating to me. So as much as I say changing culture is very difficult, there is no question. I have worked in organizations in the state where there's just, because I just thought, I was new in my career and I just thought the place was toxic. I loved my colleagues, still have good relationships with them. And I just thought, oh man, this kind of work must just lead to toxicity. Turns out the leader was just toxic. Go back to this place after I left a few years later, and there's a different leader. And oh my gosh, if you were to diagnose that cultural health, you'd be like, this place is healthy now. The vibe there was so vastly different. The cultural health was totally changed. Now, let me explain something to you. There are two ways to look at cultural health. And one of them is less obvious. The other one is more obvious. Let me go to the less obvious first, okay? So if we were to say something is an unhealthy culture, really it's quite simple. You could even have a positive work environment and it still be an unhealthy culture. Why? So you take your current culture, and if you say this doesn't align with our strategy, or it's not exactly aligned with our values and our desired culture, if there is a gap, you would say that's an unhealthy culture. Even though it's not necessarily toxic, If there is a gap between your current culture and the culture you want that best fits your purpose, your strategy, and the values and underlying assumptions that you have, the bigger that gap is, we would, like as consultants on our team, we would come into your agency and say, yeah, there's a gap there. That's an unhealthy culture. The more you can, even if it's not toxic, the more you align the current culture and the desired culture, the more healthy your culture will be. Okay. And then secondarily, how do you know if your culture is unhealthy, even if it's not toxic? Generally speaking, it'll be in two ways: outcomes, right? You're not meeting certain measures, your KPIs, or if you were to assess engagement, you'd go back and be like, why is it? It's not toxic here, but there's low engagement. We might go back and assume there's an unhealthy, not necessarily toxic, but an unhealthy culture, meaning there's a gap there. Okay. Now here, let's go to the more obvious way. Some of us just have unfortunately, we just work in toxic cultures, and that would also be, maybe it goes without saying, an unhealthy culture. So you've got a list here of things that, when I say pressure to cover, it means like all of us can't be exactly who we are. We might be a different person at work than we are at home or in other areas of our life. But when that becomes so suppressive that I'm allowed to talk about anything outside of work, that's pressure to cover. Hyper-competitiveness is a toxic sign where it's like, I got to beat everybody. I got to beat all my colleagues. And we don't actually have team support here. That's toxic. Pressure to overwork is toxic, but so is pressure to underwork. And there are cultures where you have these norms that are established where it's like, hey, don't do too much because then I have to do stuff, right? Cynicism, I think, is maybe one of the biggest signs of toxic culture that we have right now. And then anytime, like I just said before, there's gap between artifacts, assumptions, or these canyons, these massive rifts between espoused and enacted values, tends to be a toxic culture. Quickly, will you throw in the chat here? Look, we got 400 people here. We got more on the live stream who can't do this. Will you throw up other signs you think of? And no, don't put any names. Don't put like my boss, Dan, or something like that as a sign of a toxic culture. What are we missing here, though, in terms of other signs of toxic culture? Because this is not an exhaustive list. Go in the chat. Will you throw in there what you would say? I think this is also a sign. Inconsistent. Oh, crap. That's good, Steve. Inconsistency. Ooh, good old boys culture. Stay in your lane. Focus on individual rather than team. Ooh, office humor. That's interesting. Shame and sensitivity. Unwillingness to share knowledge. Disrespect. Deanna, that's a good one. Doing the bare minimum is all that matters. That's a little sign of low engagement. Holy crap, these are good. High turnover, for sure. This is the second time we've seen disrespect on there, or lack of respect. That is good. Second time we've seen good old boys club. I'm saying that right? Good old girls club. Empty and too frequent praise. Tracy, that's good. Guys, I can't read all of these. I hope you will go and read these. Blame culture. Gossip's another one. Sarcasm, I might throw in that cynicism one. Silos, we just had off the shelf about silos that I know was well received. Inadequate training, for sure. Illegal, unethical behavior. Oh my gosh, you guys, those are good. I apologize. I cannot read all of those. I hope you are scrolling through these. I can't because I have to stay on the slides. Resistance to change is a big one. By the way, Robert puts resistance to change. Fear of DHRM. Who put that one? How dare you? Just kidding. That's fair, right? Lots of people fear HR. But resistance to change is one. But I would also say too frequent change for no reason is another sign potentially of a toxic culture, where it's like change after change. Just, we're not solving any problems, but so I can say I made a change is another example, right? So Robert, that's really good. You guys, these are so good. Okay, signs of toxic culture. Here, let me just add, I'm going to throw in this there quickly. I've shared this lots of times before. This is classic organizational literature stuff here. Another thing that is problematic is when we don't give opportunity. It's called a voice culture. When people are afraid to speak up. So if something is happening in my organizational culture, I'll try and go through this quickly, that I don't like. There are, generally speaking, 4 responses. Exit is I quit. Lots of people do this, right? We talked about this with selection, attraction, attrition. People are like, that culture is not for me, I'm leaving. But that's not always realistic for people, right? Jobs are scarce, it's hard to come by, right? A lot of other people go to neglect. I'll stay here, I hate it, I'm treated disrespectfully, it's a toxic culture, so I'm going to quietly quit. It's like one of my favorite lines from Seinfeld, where Newman, the postal worker, Jerry says, "Did you quit the post office?" He said, "Well, kind of. I'm still collecting paychecks. I just don't deliver the mail anymore." Right? That's quiet quitting, right? That's neglect. Then other people, this is far too common. They go to, I don't like the label for this. It's called loyalty. They wait and they'll be like, "Okay, I'll just do whatever. It sucks here. I'm not going to say anything. I'll just go along and do," as Deanna talked about, "I'll do the bare minimum." Right? I'll do the bare minimum. What we want is voice cultures. We want to create cultures. If people don't feel like they can say when there's misalignment between our spouse values and our actual values or our underlying assumptions, we don't have a voice culture. It's toxic. So they're willing to speak up and say, "I think there's ways we could be better." That's a voice culture. Okay. The only thing that changed in the slide here is look at the bottom. So if I go back, it's called loyalty. I'd rather call it compliance. And here are actual phrases that I've heard multiple times over my career with the state of Utah. There's some trying to change to a positive culture, some sort of change, as Richard talked about, and they say, "This too shall pass." Or someone comes in and try to make a positive change, and you and I say, "I'll be here longer than they are. I know that executive director is going to leave, or I know that director is going to leave. I'll be here longer. I'll just wait it out," and go to neglect. We'd rather be in a situation where we can give people voice and they can say, "Let me tell you why I don't think this is good." Okay. Wait till next week. It'll change. That's exactly right. So here's sometimes my fear is that this is our voice culture, right? If you've got people, this is from Tim Clark. If people are afraid to give an incorrect answer or make a mistake, you don't have a good voice culture. If they're afraid to express their emotions at work, not out of control emotions, but any emotions, you've got an unhealthy culture, a toxic culture, right? A bad voice culture. This is a big one to me. If they're afraid to express disagreement, you do not have a voice culture. And if you don't have a voice culture, I'm telling you, you likely have a toxic culture. If they're afraid to point out a mistake, ask a real question, not a superficial question, but a question of like, "Wait, why is that change better?" Or to challenge the way things are done, to really say, "Hey, isn't there a better way to do things?" If they're afraid to do that, you have a poor voice culture, and you likely have a toxic culture. Okay. So we don't have time to do this now, but what I've done with groups is we do this exercise live is I actually have them rate your current culture. So just think about this. If I were to ask you to, I'm not going to take the time to do this now, but if I were to ask you, thank you, David, who has a fear in doing that. If you had to rate your current agency on your voice culture, 1 being, "Yeah, I feel safe to do this," and 5 being totally unsafe, and I'm not going to make you do this because a lot of you have peers on here from your organization. But if you're afraid to give an incorrect answer or make a mistake, how safe do you feel in doing that? I think I worry about those ones less. And the ones I worry most about and that I'm most interested in, and do not respond in the chat to this, but think about it. If I were to make you do this, how confident are you in expressing disagreement, in pointing out a mistake, in challenging the way things are done here and saying, "Are we actually solving anything?" Where is your safety level? We want our agency cultures, our voice cultures, to be at 5s. Okay. We want them to be at 4s and 5s. Unfortunately, as we've done this exercise live, it's too frequently they're 1s and 2s. Okay. Too frequently they are 1s and 2s. So again, you'll have access to these slides. We'll make sure you get these. But I wanted you to see that, right? So finally, the last few minutes that I have with you here, I hope we're doing okay energy-wise. What are our strategies for culture change? At the very outset here, I said that culture is difficult to change, and it is. And in fact, let's say you're a frontline supervisor. Let's say you're an individual contributor in your organization, as many of you are who take our off-the-shelf series. And you're like, "Well, why does this matter to me then if it's difficult to change culture?" That's important to know because you want to be aware of what your culture is in the first place to know how it aligns with your personal values. But also there are things that you and I can do in what we call microcultures or microclimates to start to make changes. Okay. So very often we don't realize how powerful culture is until we try to implement a new strategy or program. And then all of a sudden, if that strategy or program violates the actual assumptions or the central norms and values of our organization's culture, oh my gosh, you feel the real power and the real weight of the organization's culture. Okay. So look at these. As far as culture change is concerned, this is about as important as it gets. First, I'm going to give you 5 questions as you strive to change your microcultures or your organizational culture. These are 5 questions that we need to ask ourselves. So you got to align strategy to purpose and culture. And you need to ask yourself the question: why do we need to shift or change our culture? What do we want to? What is it that is deficient? Are KPIs lacking? Are engagement levels lacking? Is it toxic? How do we know? Or are we just trying to change the culture so that we feel like we're doing something? That's an important distinction. You got to answer. You got to be able to. Does it align with our purpose and strategy, or is there a misalignment, so we should change our culture? Okay. Then you need to focus on a few critical behavioral shifts. Changing culture is difficult, so if you can just change a few things, like I talked about with John Barron and the gratitude culture, right? That's really helpful. So the question you have to ask yourself is, in our new aspired culture, what new behaviors would be common, and which former or ingrained cultures would be gone? You need to be able to answer that. What would we expect to see from members of our organization in this new culture that is not currently happening, right? Then you need to honor the best of the existing culture. There is a reason. Very often, new leaders come in there and be like, I'm going to wipe out the old culture and change the new culture. The old culture sucks. There's a reason that culture exists, because of the environmental fit, for any number of reasons, right? So you and I need to ask the question, what in our current culture, even though we're trying to change it, are assets, and why did those things exist in the first place? Because you want to make sure that you're honoring the best of the existing culture. And those of you that are raising hands, we'll get to questions in a bit, okay, at the end, so we can let people leave if they need to. Finally, or fourthly, you need to integrate formal and informal embedding mechanisms. We talked about that. Then you need to ask yourself, are we ignoring the informal side of the cultural change? So a lot of times we'll change reporting structures, or we'll move locations, or we'll have a merger or something like that. But if you ignore the informal dialogues and discussions and stories that are being shared and other things, the culture change is not likely to be successful, right? And then finally, you got to measure and monitor the cultural change. How do you know if the culture is changing or not? Do we have measures? The question you ask yourself is, do we have measures in place to tell us if we're improving? Do we have milestones that we hit will tell us? Have our underlying assumptions actually changed? Are we seeing critical behavioral change at all levels? If not, the culture is probably not changing. Okay, so these 5 questions are really critical. Again, Cameron and Quinn, here's the truth. Your organizational culture will change only as much as individual behaviors change. So can you create a culture in which individuals want to actually change the way they conduct themselves? Without that, culture will not change, right? Okay, so lastly here, my last couple minutes here, I'm going to do this quickly with you. Annie McKee, again, emotional intelligence, she helped write Primal Leadership and some other things. Culture expert said, very often you're not going to be able to single-handedly change your culture, but you can always create a resonant or a healthy micro culture. And the way you do that, again, I've used this image before, is you've got to, it always floors me every time I'm on a plane. They tell you, like, hey, when you're doing your oxygen mask, do it for yourself first and then help children. It always seemed backwards to my value system. I'm like, no, we got to help kids first. That sort of things. Like, no, you do it for yourself first, because then you got to be able to help others. That advice is very often true in organizational changes as well. You got to start with yourself. You've got to reflect and be like, what kind of behaviors am I doing that are contributing to the culture? And if the underlying assumptions of our culture are this, can I work here? Does this align with my values? There's lots of times where it's like, no, I got to move on from this place because my values aren't aligned. Secondarily, you repair relationships. This sounds kind of funny, kind of preachy, right? But you've got to go to others that you have toxicity with or conflict with. We talked about a lot about this in the last one I did called Get Along and Go Far, that webinar. How you can repair relationships with people. You got to have tough conversations with people and say, hey, I'm trying to create a different culture here, and actually do the hard work of making sure the people that you are immediately surrounded with, that you've got good vibes, to use a modern term, with them. And then finally, Annie McKee says, form a coalition. Start with what you can do. You don't have to be a supervisor. You don't have to be a boss, but you may want to think about the webinar Tara did on managing up, get your boss involved and other things and say, hey, I think this should be the culture we have on our team. Can we talk about that? Right? And really, I mean, it's kind of simplistic, but start with yourself, repair relationships, and form a coalition is how you start to keep a culture from becoming toxic. And it's the things that you and I can do right now, no matter what position you have. formal authority or not, to help change a culture, right? Now, last thing here is these are other things we can do to create a voice culture of positivity and firm inherent worth. Everyone should feel valued and be in a culture of respect where you work. Don't punish people when they speak up and say they want to change the culture. They find misalignment between the culture that they have, that you want, and the culture that you actually have. Make sure that your organization has good upward and downward communication. Distinguish between listening and adoption. So reward people who say things about how to improve, even if you don't adopt their ideas. Reward them just for speaking up, right? And then redefine loyalty. Just going along with a toxic culture is not loyalty. Loyalty, real loyalty and commitment to an organization is when they say, I think we can do better, right? So this is culture. This is that final slide. If you understand this about culture, it is, you understand lots about organizational culture. We've got to make our agencies the best cultures they can be. Last thing, remember, sign up on the link for next month from JJ on how to ask better questions. It'll absolutely change your professional life. Quick, lot of information. You'll get the slides, you'll get the recording. Thank you, everybody. We're right at 11. We need to stop. I'll hang around for a second, assuming they don't boot me out of here, to answer any questions you might have. But let's go and start changing our cultures and make sure that they are as positive, as healthy, and aligned to our values as possible. Okay? Thanks. Good seeing you, Stephanie. Miss you too. Thanks, everybody. And I'll stick around for a minute if you have questions.